You've felt it before. You put on the headset, the game loads, it looks incredible. The lighting, the depth, the sense of scale. For about 30 seconds you feel like you're somewhere else entirely, and then the game asks you to do the same thing you did 30 seconds ago. And somewhere around the 20-minute mark you take the headset off. Not because you're tired, not because you're done, because the game already gave you everything it had. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Most VR games are mobile games with better graphics. Not in terms of visuals, not in terms of technology, in terms of design philosophy, the loop structure, the session length assumption, the mechanical depth, the way they treat the player's time. Beat Saber is Candy Crush with controllers. SUPERHOT VR is an endless runner in disguise. Even some of the most praised VR titles are built around a single mechanic repeated until you stop playing. That's not an accident, that's a choice. A deliberate industry-wide choice that the people making it understand completely and refuse to talk about publicly. And that choice is quietly killing VR's potential as a serious gaming platform. Mobile game design isn't defined by the screen size, it's defined by assumptions. The core assumption of mobile game design is that the player has limited time, limited attention, and limited tolerance for complexity. The session will be short, 5 minutes, maybe 10. The player might be interrupted at any moment. The game needs to deliver a dopamine hit fast, reset cleanly, and be ready for the next session without friction. From that assumption, everything else follows. Short loops. You complete a round, a level, a puzzle, in under 5 minutes. The loop resets. You go again. There's no narrative momentum carrying you forward, because narrative momentum requires sustained attention, something mobile design doesn't trust the player to provide. Single mechanic focus, complexity is friction. Friction is churn. A mobile game teaches you one thing, and then asks you to do that one thing better, faster, against harder conditions. Not because the designers lack imagination, because adding a second mechanic requires onboarding time the player isn't assumed to have artificial progression. Since the mechanical depth isn't there to sustain engagement, mobile games lean on progression systems. Numbers go up, unlocks happen. The sense of advancement is manufactured because the gameplay itself doesn't generate it organically. Now open your VR library and look at it honestly. How many of those games have sessions that naturally run longer than 20 minutes? How many of them have more than 1 or 2 core mechanics? How many of them generate a genuine sense of progression from gameplay depth rather than from unlocked systems? The overlap with mobile design philosophy is not coincidental. There are real reasons this happened. Some of them are legitimate. Empathetic fatigue is real. 30 minutes in a headset is genuinely more taxing than 30 minutes at a desk. Designing for shorter sessions isn't pure laziness. It's a response to a real physical constraint. The hardware install base is small. When you're developing for an audience of a few million rather than a few hundred million, budget constraints shape design decisions. Deep, complex game systems are expensive to build and expensive to test. A single polished mechanic is achievable with a small team and a limited budget. The market skews toward newcomers. A significant portion of VR players at any given moment are people who just got a headset, and newcomers need accessible entry points. Designing for depth means designing for players who don't exist in large numbers yet. These are real constraints. I'm not dismissing them. But here's the problem. The industry responded to these constraints by building an entire design culture around them. And design cultures outlast the constraints that created them. The budget limitations of 2017 Quest development are not the budget limitations of 2026. The install base of 2019 is not the install base of 2026. Physical fatigue is real, but it doesn't prevent 30-minute sessions. It prevents 2-hour sessions, and there's enormous design space between 20 minutes and 2 hours that VR has almost entirely ignored. Frustrated because constraints became excuses, and the excuses became a ceiling. But there's a layer underneath this that's more calculated than it looks. Meta wants you to put the headset on every day, not for one long session, for many short ones. Daily active users is the metric that drives platform valuation. A player who spends 20 minutes in VR every day is more valuable to Meta's business model than a player who spends 3 hours in VR once a week, even though the second player is having a demonstrably richer experience. Mobile gaming cracked this code 15 years ago. Short sessions, daily return triggers, streak mechanics, notification hooks, all of it engineered to maximize daily active users rather than session depth. Meta has studied this model. Their platform recommendations to developers. The guidelines that shape what gets featured, what gets promoted, what gets the marketing support that determines whether a game reaches an audience. These recommendations quietly favor designs that drive daily return behavior. A game that takes 40 hours to complete and requires sustained 2-hour sessions to reach its best content is a nightmare for this metric. A game with a 5-minute loop that players return to daily for 6 months is a dream. This is why Beat Saber gets featured. This is why 11 Table Tennis gets featured. Not because they're bad games, they're genuinely good at what they do. But what they do is maximize daily return behavior, which is exactly what the platform wants. And developers who want platform support learn quickly, and usually without being told explicitly what kind of game gets that support. The mobile design philosophy didn't emerge from VR developers lacking ambition. It was structurally incentivized by the platform that controls distribution. Here's what this model costs. Narrative depth. Games that tell stories, real stories with character development and emotional stakes and narrative momentum, require sessions long enough for the player to invest emotionally. You cannot fall in love with a world in 20 minutes. You cannot care about a character you've spent 2 total hours with across 2-week intervals. Lone Echo built a narrative. It had characters you remembered, a world that felt lived in, and it was a commercial and critical success precisely because it treated the player's emotional investment as something worth earning. Its sequel underperformed because the audience for that kind of VR experience had not grown proportionally to the platform's user base. Because the platform had spent years optimizing for short-loop games that don't build the audience for deep ones. Mechanical complexity. The games that define flat gaming's greatest achievements, Dark Souls, Disco Elysium, Dwarf Fortress, even something like Hollow Knight, are defined by systems that interact with each other in ways the player spends dozens of hours exploring. That complexity is the product. The discovery of how the systems fit together is where the value lives. VR has produced almost nothing in this category, not because it's impossible. The medium is capable of extraordinary interaction design, because the platform incentive structure actively works against the development timelines and session assumptions required to build it. Community and mastery culture. Games with mechanical depth generate communities of mastery, players who dedicate hundreds of hours to understanding a system deeply. These communities are the backbone of long-term platform health. They create content, attract new players, and sustain engagement years after a game's launch window. VR's mastery communities are tiny, not because VR players lack dedication. Echo VR proved that dedicated VR communities absolutely form. But Echo VR was killed by Meta, because it wasn't generating the daily active user numbers that justify platform support under a mobile-derived metric system. This is the part that should genuinely frustrate you. The designers building VR games know this. The platform architects at Meta know this. The publishers funding VR titles know this. It comes up at developer conferences. It gets written about in post-mortems. Independent VR developers have been making this argument publicly for years, that the platform incentive structure is pushing VR towards shallow design, that the mobile comparison is accurate and damning, that there is an audience for deeper VR experiences that the current system actively fails to serve. And the response from the platforms has been consistent. Nothing. Not denial. Not argument. Not a counter-proposal. Just the continued operation of a recommendation and promotion system that rewards short-loop design and the continued funding of games built around that system. Because from Meta's perspective, the mobile model works. Daily active users are growing. Headset sales are increasing. The business metrics that matter to a platform company are moving in the right direction. The fact that VR is developing a design culture that caps its own creative ceiling, that is producing a generation of games that will not be remembered, that will not define the medium, that will not attract the serious long-form players who would elevate the platform's cultural status. These are not metrics that appear on a quarterly earnings call. They're the kind of cost that only becomes visible in retrospect. When you look back at a platform and ask why it never produced its Citizen Kane moment, why it never had a Dark Souls, why its most culturally significant title is still Beat Saber, a game from 2018 that the developers themselves describe as a music experience, not a game. VR feels like mobile because the people controlling the platform decided mobile was the right model. Not because it was the only model available, not because the technology forced the decision, because mobile metrics are legible, defensible, and optimizable, and deep game design is slow, expensive, and hard to measure in quarterly increments. That's the honest answer. The medium is capable of more. The evidence is in the handful of titles that ignored the platform incentive and built something with actual depth, and were loved for it by everyone who found them, even as the platform failed to amplify them. Moved Lone Echo, Asgard's Wrath 2, Walking Dead Saints and Sinners. These games exist, their audiences are real. The appetite for serious VR experiences is there. The platform just isn't feeding it. And until the metric that drives platform decisions changes, until daily active users is replaced by something that captures long-term engagement, creative depth, cultural impact, nothing else will change either. VR will keep feeling like mobile, because that's what it's being designed to be.